Thanks, Emma. Hi, welcome everybody to this session at CTO CraftCon, where we'll be debating the relative merits of tests versus observability. I'm Glyn Roberts, as mentioned, CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt. I'll give each of the panelists a chance just to quickly introduce themselves. So, Charity, welcome. Please intro.
Hi, I'm Charity, CTO, co-founder at Honeycomb.io, ops engineer for life.
Great. And Aubrey.
Aubrey Stearn, currently CTO at Betta, but I'm also fractional CTO, so I work with quite a few startups at the moment.
And Adriana as well, please.
Hey, I'm Adriana Villela. I am currently a senior developer advocate at Lightstep, and I enjoy all things tech.
Fantastic. So as this is only a 30-minute session, very short, do get your questions in if you do have any. We will have time near the end of the session. And yeah, let's kick off. So firstly, my first question to you, Charity. Let's define what test and observability are. So from my perspective, testing is quite simple to understand. Code, you're testing your code and your data before going into production. That could be automated or manual. With observability, that is mainly defining around monitoring and anomaly detection or inside production. Is that how, would you agree with that definition?
Well, that's definitely what all the vendors would like you to believe, is that it's just a generic term to replace, monitoring, telemetry, observability. It's all the same thing. That is not my belief. I think that we need a different word to disambiguate, the practice of understanding our more complex systems and using non-pre-aggregated data. Monitoring has historically been about aggregated data. Observability is about non-aggregated data so that you can, slice and dice. To sum it all up, I mean, I've ranted about this at length, and I will not do that here because, like you said, we only have 30 minutes. But I would describe it as monitoring and anomaly detection in production that supports high cardinality, high dimensionality, and explorability.
Fantastic. Okay then, and on to my second question, probably for you, Aubrey. Which one should you actually prioritize more, tests or observability? I mean, from my perspective, testing is crucial to development, so surely that's the most important.
This is could be a very difficult one to answer depending on who you are or where you are in the cycle. So if you are at the very beginning of your engineering cycle, testing probably is the most important thing for you. It's how you know that your code works, how you communicate structure and flow to other engineers. If you're in production, the observability part becomes as important as the testing part. I think again, it totally depends on where you are. I mean, for me, they both go hand in hand. The observability part is part of control theory. It's how do we know that something is working without seeing the internals of it. I think that's super important when you're in production. A good engineering team, I think, would be thinking about the observability side when they're doing that first part of engineering, when they're starting to conceptualize the code and the features that they're building. They should be starting to think about the infrastructure and the observability of that stuff along with the testing. I'm a bit of a pedant on my tests. I like my 100% test coverage. I think it's like a super easy number to hit just by path-based coverage alone. But it will depend, and it will always depend on the kind of systems that you're working with and whether you can do automated testing, or whether you can achieve the level of observability that you want with something. You're always going to be hostage almost to the technology that you're using, and there's some legacy stuff that just still is incredibly difficult to write the kind of testing that we're talking about today.
I would absolutely agree. Something that I have said many times in the past is that if I had to choose one or the other, and I don't, thank God, let nobody say that I'm advocating you choose one or the other, but if I had to choose one or the other, I would always choose observability and the ability to test in production, because that's the only actual source of truth that you have.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Charity on that, because the way I look at it is, in choosing observability, it means that you're putting enough information in your code so that you know what the hell is going on when things break. And if you don't have that information, then how are you supposed to be able to debug an issue? So, and critically, like, that's where we see our problems, right? Like things happen in production. If you don't have any insights in that, how are you supposed to understand? So all the tests in the world won't necessarily prepare you for that, but observability will. It'll prepare you for those like weird moments of, oh my God, what's going on? I have no idea.
Sorry, I don't mean to keep talking over you. There's a bit of a lag here, and so I apologize, Adriana. But like code on its own is dead code. Code isn't real until it's being used by users in production, and that's where observability is really the only tool that you have in your box.
I mean, it's super interesting because with most webinars and talks around this, it's always about testing. I don't hear hardly that much at all about observability. So it's great that, to consider it as so highly important, as a slightly more important than testing, but obviously testing is still required as well, of course. So let's talk about observability levels. Adriana, what observability levels do you believe you need to ensure that you actually have?
I think there's a bare minimum of like having enough information emitted by your system so you know what's going on. And when you have enough of that information where you don't have to keep adding more telemetry to your code, that's the observability level. Like I think it's good to have a minimum observability level, but like realistically to be able to do proper troubleshooting of your code in production or even in testing for that matter to help your testers out, you have to have the minimum amount of information to be able to troubleshoot. And I think that kind of varies from project to project. I think it's teased out in testing. I think it's teased out in production. I think it's an iterative process.
It's kind of like what Aubrey was just saying. You are held hostage to your tech stack and your actual facts on the ground at some point.
Okay. Is there a case where you have too much observability, too high a level, too much data to be able to make meaningful judgments against them?
In theory, in reality, almost never seen. In theory, yes. But like I almost think of your telemetry in production like a headlamp, right? When you're debugging something, you need to shine the headlamp on it, and you should be debugging it by adding telemetry first, right? And as you move around your code base, then the parts of the code base that have a lot more complexities tend to accrue a lot more visibility for good reasons. And this is why, when people are moving from a monitoring point of view to an observability point of view, they're often like, how do I put observability throughout my entire systems? And I'm kind of like, if you just make this how you debug your systems, it will naturally happen, right? Sorry, I'm not trying to dominate the airtime. I'm going to keep up for a while.
No problem. And okay, so for you, Aubrey, what do you believe is the best approach for actually testing and observability?
If the question is there a balance? Again, it depends on where you are in the life cycle. I mean, Charity's touched on test in production, which is, again, one of my favorite things in the world, and is a very conscious choice in how you engineer. It's a behavioral choice. It causes a particular kind of behavior. There we go. When you have a car, do you buy another car to de-risk the fact that your first car might stop working? You probably don't. You might get AA and some other stuff to go and make sure it's okay, but you would certainly not have another car to offset the chance that something stops working. But weirdly, in what we do, we tend to create environments like they're second cars, and I think it's such a strange thing. It's a dilution of your primary value. You're diluting all of your effort into now two things rather than the thing that actually matters. And I think when you look at what that causes in engineers, particularly, good engineers will step up to the plate. They'll start to think about the risk. They'll start to ask questions about the customer. They'll start to ask about, can I take these risks? If I'm engineering a mortgage journey, what will happen to the customer on a mortgage journey if it doesn't work? Well, with mortgages, they'll probably come back the next day. And so can you take risks with that journey? Yeah, you probably could. With financial transactions, is there risk there that you can't take? Absolutely, right? And so you have to engineer in a particular way. But if you let people invest in these second cars, they'll engineer towards that second car, that safety net. Whereas if you take it away, they naturally step up and up their game. And for me, I'm all about that, which is why I like engineers that do full stack, that holistically think about their infrastructure, that think about the products they produce all the way to the customer and traverse up and down their stack. Because, you know, when we look at things like security, when you find security issues, they're always the cracks. It's always the cracks in infrastructure between software and infra where these things leak in. And having people that can traverse the whole thing, I think you're less likely to have these things happen. It's certainly, you know, there's always space for specialists, but people that can be generalists, that can think about, you know, the synergy between testing, between observability, between, you know, again, owning your platform and product. I think that's your best outcome.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point. Sorry, go ahead, Adriana.
Sorry, yeah, I would take it a step further, actually, because so there have been some tools that have come out recently that actually marry testing and observability. So there's two that I can think of that I know of, Trace-Test and Malaby, where basically the idea is they take your existing traces and allow you to create test cases based on your traces. So you create assertions from your traces. So now, like, you're basically leveraging stuff that you're already emitting, right, from your system to create your tests. And I think that's like such a, they're such cool tools, because I think they empower not only our testers, they empower developers, they empower SREs. Like, it's empowerment across the board.
Okay, so on this is really interesting. So what Aubrey was talking about was the fact that you have multiple environments before production. You have your development, your UAT, your QA before it gets to production, and obviously there's safety nets before you actually get there, which from an ex-developer, I love that. That's what I like. Obviously what we're saying here, and one of Charity's favorite topics, is actually testing in production. So that sounds really scary from my perspective. Charity, could you just give your view on why it's so important?
It sounds scary, but it isn't, because every single one of us does it, whether we admit it or not. And so the point of this somewhat, you know, flamboyant talking about testing and production is to sort of try to surface that and be like, look, we all do it. The only question is whether or not you admit that you do it or not, and then invest in doing it better. Or if you're just doing it as a last resort and just sort of like, and I loved everything that you were saying, Aubrey, about that, because I could not agree more. You know, we the scarcest resource in our lives is developer cycles, 100%. And what we find is that we've been sinking so many of those into staging and pre-production that we've been starving production, right? And like most of us are going to have way more of a marginal impact if we start looking at our tooling set for production. How can we find things? How can we reproduce things? How can we fork traffic? Can we inspect it in different ways? You're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And that's where, you know, I've seen so much developer time just go like flush down the toilet when it comes to trying to repro things offline and in staging and in their development environments. And it's just, there are ways to do this stuff non-destructively in production, but it does require investing in these tools so that you aren't just like doing it fly by the seat of your pants every single time something goes wrong.
Wonderful. Okay, well, my next question ties into one of the audience questions. So the audience question from was to Adriana, say, what's the name of the tool you mentioned? But my actual question is, what advice on what and how to actually implement this? So if we could start off with... yeah, so if we can start off, Adriana, with the tools that you use and how and what you actually implement when you're doing these tests and observability.
Yeah, so the two tools that I mentioned are Trace-Test and Malaby. So basically the idea is you're instrumenting your code, and the de facto standard out there for instrumenting your code now is OpenTelemetry, and all the vendors are fully behind it, which is super awesome. So we don't have to fight over standards, yay. So then, like, I haven't really played too much with, I haven't played at all with Malaby, but I did have a chance to play around with Trace-Test, and the idea is pretty simple. It takes your traces that your program has emitted and basically allows you to create test cases based on those traces. And I know that they came out with some newer versions more recently that allow you, that have more bells and whistles and allow you to do things programmatically. But the the basic concept is trace-based testing, and it was actually introduced by Ted Young in, I think, KubeCon North America back in 2018. So it's cool, like, and this was like a conceptual thing. So it's cool to see organizations now taking this idea and putting it into practice because we have the language to do it, which is open telemetry.
I want to echo that plug for OTel 100,000%. Like, the point of OTel is that, we've all experienced vendor lock-in because nobody wants to re-instrument their code again, right? The point of OTel is you re-instrument it once and you never have to do it again. And you should be able to try out different vendors. Like, you should be able to break out of that cage and try out different vendors without having to do all of this really painful re-instrumentation again. And I also kind of want to echo something that Adriana just said, which is that for a lot of people who are kind of trying to wrap their head around, monitoring versus observability versus whatever, a pretty simple litmus test is, does my tool also do tracing, or do I need to have a different tool to do tracing? Because observability is based in these arbitrarily wide structured data blobs, which are effectively spans, right? A span is just a wide data blob with a couple of, unique IDs. And if you're having to do like a tool for metrics, a tool for logs, a tool for tracing, it's not observability. But if you're able to like switch back and forth between these data types and get tracing, it probably is observability. And the more you invest in tools that have to do with traces, the happier, the better off you're going to be when you're debugging these really complex microservices and distributed systems.
Great. And Aubrey, do you have any particular advice on what to implement from your side of things, considering you're very much in the financial markets normally?
I'm the really boring one, so I won't really touch vendors. I tend to work pretty much exclusively these days with AWS. So if I can't put it in Terraform, we certainly aren't using it. But my go-to all the time is usually I'll be using CloudWatch scheduled events and a Lambda to go and create some sort of like tactical observability. We'll go and pipe it into CloudWatch custom metrics. That was my go-to when I landed on the site. I had 50 environments out there with no observability whatsoever, and we thought, okay, we'll just create one set of Terraform, blast it through all 50, and suddenly we've got observability in a couple of weeks, which was super great. Recently I've done a lot more Firehose, Athena and QuickSight sort of flows, more I guess data science, BI sort of stuff, and that has worked really well as well. I mean, right, it's probably the easiest one is your log levels, right? Get your decent log levels, like really, really harden those and just report on them. And it's a really good indicator that something is or isn't working. And I know we mentioned like what's the right level to sort of have. If you can wrap that stuff in feature flags as well, so you can dial it up and dial it down again when you feel like you need that stuff. Just that you can have too much data. I've definitely cost myself a lot of money on CloudWatch custom metrics before. So I think if you can save the verbose, like anything below level 50 for emergencies and sort of keep it at the 50s, then there's a good practice.
Okay, great. So next question from the audience then. Sachin, hopefully I'm saying that correct. What are your thoughts where the tech stack involves a combination of SaaS tools, LMSs, etc., microservices, and data science models? Whoever wants to take that first.
I'm not sure I understand how this... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was to say, I can't say... having worked with a lot of the data science stuff recently, I have found it more brittle and a lot more immature than a lot of the stuff that we work on as like core engineering, especially from the AWS Glue perspective. That stuff is not well documented. It seems to evolve on a weekly basis, not super easy to instrument, even as someone that goes all in on the Terraform. I find it quite hard to get that stuff right and to get that instrumented to the level I would with other pieces of code and more mature parts of the ecosystem. I think this is where you probably use your observability to try and look at the outputs rather than the white box stuff on the inside, and do it that way until it's more mature.
Sure. So the data science part is the part that we believe is most difficult to implement decent observability at this stage. Cool. All right then. Okay, so another one of my questions, as we were talking about production in development, how do you actually sell that to development teams? So that's not something we touched on. So we touched on the fact that there's a lot of value to the business by doing it, by investing at the end of the process rather than earlier stages. There should there be a massive amount of confidence in the observability. How do you actually sell this in? Probably charity first, because it sounds like you've been doing this a lot.
Well, the first thing is whenever you're dealing with a skittish, whether it's development team or business team, is you probably don't want to use the words testing and production. If you think people are going to react to that, then use your gut and don't talk about it, right? You can call it like real-time observation, or whatever. You can also do
testing
a lot of things to do this safely. Testing on the edge, perfect.
There we go.
Rebranding. There's also a lot of ways to do this safely. Yeah, if you've got somebody who's not used to looking in production, first of all, I would try and emphasize to my engineers that I don't believe you can really be a senior engineer until you're fluent in production. And I would hope that they have some SREs or some ops folks who can take their hands and help them become more proficient in it, because I think those are tools and practices that will supercharge your career. There are also ways to do this safely and non-destructively. You can set up ways where you're jailing some stuff, or you're forking queries, or you're doing things to send it off to a sandbox where you can run a debugger, or you can do whatever the hell you want, because it's not going to return any garbage to the user. Right, so that's probably where I would start. But the way you sell it to engineering teams is just like, this is such a time saver. How much time have you spent trying to reproduce things in your dev box that just didn't exist there or would never happen there? Like reproducing things in production is going straight to the source. There is stuff that your users will do that you will never think of testing for, and so doing it in production is just like it's like putting your thumb right in a beating heart, like going straight to the source.
I assume you've got to be a reasonable sized team to feel comfortable to be able to execute at this type of level, though.
No, right from day one.
I think you just have to instill the confidence that like they have enough information to be able to debug this stuff in prod, to be able to do it. Like, seeing is believing, right? If you can show like, hey, look, there's this weird stuff happening in prod, but I've got all the information I need to figure out what's going on, then it becomes a lot less scary versus like, you say to someone debug in prod and it's like, I have no idea what's going on. Like, how do you make heads and tails of it?
There are lots of tools where you're not even like SSHing in or connecting to the code in the back end. You're just debugging in production by adding telemetry. It's completely non-destructive. There's nothing you can possibly do to break it. Just add some debugging output, and it's the slightly graduated way of just looking at like printfs, right? But you're looking at them in production, so you're actually getting real data. Add some telemetry, ship, and repeat. This is an argument for shrinking the amount of time it takes you to deploy, so you can treat production as much like a REPL as possible.
I find that talking about how we change particular things is quite helpful. So the idea of operating on production while production is running. So what is a brittle change and what isn't? So your very basic like atomic unit of maybe a message processor, that's just an if statement. If I get a message with this field, then I'm going to go and run this path. Otherwise I will run the standard production path. And then you ask the team, how is that going to cause a problem? Explain to me how that blows up. And suddenly there's this realization that we can keep things moving and start to do that diversion. But then there's other parts where you're going to make a CloudFront change, for example. That is, in my opinion, a brittle change and a difficult one to go and do in production, one that I would look at de-risking by springing up a new CloudFront and testing it all out, and knowing there's no substitute for experience here, knowing where you can do this stuff and move quickly versus which parts of your infrastructure or your software stack are brittle and require a bit more safety, is everything in this. But the sensational title of test in production, it's a beautiful one for the impact. And then when everyone's mind is open thinking, oh my God, you start to really dial into that. Oh, how would we change this thing that you've got going?
You mentioned feature flags too, Aubrey. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Charity first. Aubrey. Or Adriana, there we go. Adriana first, there we go.
I was just going to say, like, just to emphasize the idea too, like, testing in production isn't a new thing per se. Like anytime we use a production system, we are testing it. I mean, there is no better way to test your code than to test it in production, because that is where your real users will be doing real things. And if you emphasize that to your engineers, that it is just business as usual, you aren't doing, like, we're not doing anything new here. I think we're just giving this thing a name is the bottom line.
Cool.
You mentioned feature flags, and I wanted to echo that, because feature flags, if you think about it, feature flags are the way that you decouple deploys and releases, so that you can be deploying constantly while letting your product managers actually release on a predictable schedule. This is one of the most powerful tools that you can implement in your systems.
Cool. One of the audience questions actually from Sashin is, what are the key skills required in a team where existing members may not have done SRE or observability before?
Communicate.
Let's start off with
a lot.
Aubrey, go ahead.
Talk about it. Talk very openly. Talk without barriers or fears of what you're doing. I think, when you are doing this kind of thing, in my opinion, you're forced to understand the customer, because you can't operate in that environment without fully understanding that risk profile. The way that we would do test in production in a bank, for example, is very different to, a job site where people are transitively coming through every day and you probably won't see them back, for a year. That profile of the customer is totally different and dictates how I can behave as an engineer and the kind of risk that I'm putting those, what production is doing. I think that's super important. I think the more you talk about that, the more open you are about your customer and certainly your approach and what you're about to do, and making sure people know you're turning on a feature flag, or you're turning something off, or you're pushing something that's about to go and branch traffic and do something different. You just talk a lot.
I think education goes a long way, and just piggybacking off of what Aubrey was saying. Yeah, you have to talk a lot. You, like, at my previous role, we were rolling out observability to the organization, and they thought it was just like managing a bunch of tools. And so I had to do like a hard pivot and say, okay, this is what observability is. This is what we have to do to go about it. It's a lot of internal advocacy.
Yeah. And curiosity, because we're engineers. We like figuring things out, right? This is really the ultimate toolbox for doing your job and doing it better. And I think it's so much more satisfying to be solving real problems for real people than it is to be, making sandcastles in the sky.
I love the analogy, sandcastles in the sky there. Okay, as we're coming near to the end of time, just got one final question from Milko. Is OpenTelemetry something that is a standard that all tools now use, or is there a standard to look for? So a lot of charity.
Yep.
OpenTelemetry is it. All the vendors are on board, except for Datadog. I will keep shaming Datadog until they actually, you can get your data into Datadog, you can't get it out. And they've blocked pull requests to get it out. And I'm really mad about it, because all the other vendors are playing nicely.
Sure. Okay, then. I just hope they're not a sponsor. Need to check that. Okay, wonderful. So, yeah, fantastic talking to you three today. I hope the audience has had a good chance. There are following talks of unconferences this on Wednesday, I believe. So I think this is another topic that's going to be brought up then. So obviously, feel free to join us then if you have any further questions. And yeah, thanks to Charity, Aubrey, and Adriana for talking with us today. You can connect with the speakers after the event on the links that can be shared in the chat, which will be their social media and their Twitters and anything else they may have. And yeah, thank you all for joining. I'm 1 minute too early, so I haven't timed this right. Emma, thank you. Are you there?